Well, I hope it's recording. Well, hello everyone. By the way, eh, for those who don't know me, my name is Jamie Turan. You may call it Jamie, since most people call it that because they cannot pronounce it correctly. Well, today I decided to do a recording about insulin, a presentation about insulin, since most people don't know how it works for especially muscle building. Some people think that it is the most effective most myotropic thing, and some people think the exact opposite, which is which at least what they say is it doesn't work. It doesn't work at all, zero. But the reality is it is between the two. It's not exactly. It is not exactly the one or the other. Somewhere between. You might use insulin in your advantage or your disadvantage. It depends on the environment which you use. We're going to talk about it. As you can see, I downloaded a picture about how insulin works, well, which is very fascinating, especially if you decided to have tiny bit research about how insulin works. You you start to realize that okay, it it has some effects on cancer. It it also it's also have a positive effect on muscle protein synthesis, mTOR, especially mammalian target of rapamycin, or target of rapamycin, or mechanistic target of rapamycin, whatever you call it. It has an effect. It basically insulin binds to its receptor, and downstream cascades begin. IRS1-2, PI3K AKT complex, and after AKT, also known as phosphokinase B, PKB, it activates mTOR. It inhibits muscle protein breakdown and promotes muscle protein synthesis. That is very important. As I've said, excuse me, as I've said previously, it definitely has properties for muscle building. Well, keep in mind that insulin has, let's say this way. Even if you don't eat, you starve for yourself, let's say for a day, 24 hours. You would still have a background insulin, which most people don't realize it. When you do a fasting blood work, there is a fasting insulin. Excuse me, there's a insulin for some reason. When you're type 2 diabetic, aka insulin resistant diabetic, you start to realize that you start to see on blood work that even when your blood glucose levels are in between range, let's say below 100, let's say 90, 85, you might still have 80 or 90 blood glucose levels, but you might have high insulin levels, which is an indicator of being insulin resistant. Also, another thing that most people get incorrectly, wrong way. Most people think that insulin stores fat. Thus, it is the only absolute thing that makes people obese, gain fat, body fat, visceral fat, or fatty liver disease. Most people think that is the only thing that contributes to it, which is absolute nonsense. Also, I want to mention that most people start to get fat by feeding the insulin it sounds funny, right? They're bodybuilders, they're supposed to do. But the funny thing is, unfortunately, at least 50% of the bodybuilders don't have any tiny bit idea of how drugs works. Well, okay, they might know a bit, but not enough to use insulin or other PEDs in their advantages and minimizing the side effects. By side effects, I mean life-threatening side effects, not the hair loss, not the oily skin. Yeah, I know that oily skin is not a concern for insulin users, but if you think about all of the PEDs in the world, all PED world, it's a side effect, obviously. Also, let's imagine a bodybuilder who uses insulin. Let's say their maintenance calories is 3,500 kilocalories, and in their bulking season, or you might say hypercaloric season, they try to gain mass, mostly skeletal muscle. And they decided to use insulin. Let's say a common use is 1 to 5 IU's phosphorylation, and they use phosphorylation. And what insulin does is it reduces blood glucose levels, aka most people call it shuttles nutrients in muscle. Okay, that's fine. But instead of being 500 kilocalories above the surplus, they start to consume more and more calories. They start to feed into insulin because of the insulin drops their blood sugar levels. Let's say it this way. In order to prevent insulin from getting them hypoglycemic, they consume more carbohydrates pre, post, and during workouts. Let's say imagine 100 grams, which is equal to 400 kilocalories. 1 gram of carbohydrate is 4 calories. Okay, that's fine. But when you do the equation, maintenance plus surplus equals the current consumed calories, right? Wrong. Here's why. They think that they consume 3,500, but in fact they consume more. 4,000 plus 900. Wow, that's really annoying, the phone ringing, and I hate it, to be honest with you. Let's do the equation. 3,500 plus 500 equals 4,000. And add 4,000 and add 400 to 4,000, which makes 4,400 kilocalories instead of 4,000. It's pretty simple, right? Still, most people don't get it. They don't decrease their consumed kilocalories from other, let's say, carbohydrate sources. Let's say white rice, for example. They don't realize it. And one more thing that they don't realize: hypoglycemia, which is low blood sugar, also increases your appetite, which is a nice survival mechanism. Your body senses low blood glucose levels. Your insulin is a regulatory hormone, it's a regulatory hormone, but Our body has also counter-regulatory hormones. When your blood glucose levels go too low, your body senses it and increases the counter-regulatory hormones, epinephrine, and glucagon, cortisol, and even growth hormone. And so your appetite tends to increase when your blood sugar drops too low. And most people tend to get sugar cravings. What it does is they tend to spoon tons of sugar. Sounds funny, yeah, but most people still tend to do that. They still tend to eat Haribos, bunch of hands full of whatever you call it. I couldn't recall. Sorry. Also, tons of studies showed that isocaloric, which means having this equal amounts, it's the same amount kilocalorie. Isocaloric studies showed that when you keep the protein same, the fat loss in hypocaloric diets are the same. I repeat, are the same. And you might think that, oh, okay, but I heard that somebody told me that insulin inhibits lipolysis and stores body fat. And yeah, it does, but think about the whole 24 hours aspect of the insulin. Your body sometimes burns more glucose, sometimes oxidizes more fats, sometimes use fats more ATP production, energy, your mitochondria, your energy powerhouse, right? Powerhouse of the cell. Sometimes use more of the one or the other. And the same goes for the storing. Sometimes your body stores more, sometimes less. The real thing is your body, at the same time, you might think that at the same time it stores fats and burns fats. The ratios are changing. Also, I gotta mention that the fact one is your dietary fats don't need insulin to get stored. It's pretty simple, right? It doesn't need. It's pretty surprising for most of you, at least I think. And in fact, the fact two is on high carb diets, you eat more carbs, especially. But it's very simple, right? You eat more carbs. But in order to have a high carbohydrate rich diet, you gotta eat less dietary fats. Also, in order to remain isocaloric when you're comparing one to the other. Okay, fine. Which means that you're gonna have more insulin because of the carbohydrates raise your blood glucose levels. So a hormone, you're gonna have a hormone that's gonna store more fat in your blood, right? But at the same time, you're gonna have another hormone that's going to get stored by insulin. It seems like you're gonna get fat, right? At least it sounds like. No, because you have a tiny bit amount of, sorry, wrong ad. You're gonna have a tiny bit of fat, dietary fats, fatty acids. So you have much higher levels of insulin to store fat, but little tiny bit levels of fat to get stored. In the other way around, on the opposite, on low carb diets, you're gonna have very high fat, but lower compared to high carb diets. A low insulin can store more fat since there are more fats or more fatty acids, but the levels of insulin are pretty low. More fat to get, let's say, stored, but less insulin to get them stored. And since you gotta remain isocaloric when you're comparing the two, at least the direct effects are the same. Can there be indirect effects for high carb or low carb? Yeah, there can be, because you might perform better in the gym with high carb diets. So you can gain more muscle with high carb diets. And also while you're dieting, you might lose your strength a bit less on high carb diets. So you don't lose your muscles. So your body composition is going to be better, because when you're cutting or hypocaloric, your body you mostly at least have to, yes, you gotta keep your by the way, sorry for stuttering. I haven't been talking in English for, I don't know, 2 years or so. Also, let's take a look at how GLUT4 translocation works. As I've said, insulin works via PI3K AKT mechanism. And while GLUT4 translocation is happening, the GLUT4s come up to cell surface and then act like a vacuum cleaner. At least in theory, they contract and let the glucose come into the cell. And as I've mentioned in the beginning, insulin is not a storage hormone as most people think. In fact, it's a regulatory hormone. It regulates your blood sugar. Is it clear so far, right? It regulates your blood sugar. In order for it to be a storage hormone, it has to go in this cell. But as you can see, it does not go in the cell. It interacts with the insulin receptor, and downstream cascades start to happening. And let's think about it deeply, tiny bit. If the insulin was a storage hormone, and the insulin resistance is the efficiency in PI3K AKT mechanism for glucose uptake, type 2 diabetics would be actually skinny. But in fact, we all know that most of the type 2 diabetics, insulin resistant diabetics, are just fat. I repeat, if it was a storage hormone, type 2 diabetic patients would be skinny. And also, let's talk about a bit science of muscle building aspects, which we didn't cover yet quite deeply. Insulin deprivation in type 1 diabetics results in a catabolic state, mostly via muscle protein breakdown. They have much higher levels of muscle protein breakdown, since it makes sense, right? Since insulin has anti-catabolic effects. Also, in burn patients, they use insulin sometimes to increase muscle protein synthesis and decrease their, let's say, to get rid of their catabolic states or to have a less catabolic state. And they tend not to use the insulin because, as you can imagine, it decreases blood glucose levels and might cause hypoglycemia. But it's very well proven that it increases muscle protein synthesis and decreases muscle protein breakdown. Also, in type 1 diabetics, there is a problem with their regulatory hormones. There is a problem with their feedback mechanism. Because in order growth hormone is many of you know, it mostly over 80% of the growth hormone turns to IGF-1 in your liver. Liver does that. But in order to do that, let's say, okay, I correct. In order it to be efficiently do that, one, you shouldn't be in a very catabolic state, and two, you gotta have some insulin in your bloodstream. When you don't have insulin in your bloodstream, you have higher levels of IGF binding protein 1, as I said, IGF binding protein 1, and low levels of IGF binding protein 3, which roughly over 70% of the IGF in healthy humans are bound to IGF binding protein 3. When you introduce insulin in type 1 diabetics, their IGF-1 levels increase and their growth hormone levels decrease. Wait a minute. I said growth hormone turns to IGF, right? How the hell a lower growth hormone levels result in higher IGF, right? There is an inefficiency in conversion. When you introduce insulin in type 1 diabetics, the inefficiency disappears and the normal state and normal processes start to begin. Thus, they start to have higher levels of IGF because of the feedback mechanism. And here, your body realizes that it has plenty of IGF-1, thus does not produce that much of higher growth hormone, which is likely making them having even more higher blood glucose levels, which is what growth hormone does. It makes body to release homosensitive lipase, which releases free fatty acid in bloodstream, and it releases glucagon, which releases glucose in bloodstream. As I said previously, I said what GH does, and growth hormone increases protein synthesis. There's no doubt about it. As I said in the very beginning of the slides presentation, I told you that while GH is mostly anabolic, it is mostly in connective tissue. I repeat, G8's anabolic activity is mostly in connective tissues, while it indirectly make you grow more muscle. But it's indirectly it can do that, but directly it's insignificant. Yeah, protein synthesis is an energy intensive process. Whenever you think about protein synthesis, you might think about inefficiency, because when you ingest dietary protein, roughly 1/3, 25 to 30, 35% of the energy coming from protein is going to be dissipated as heat. There's inefficiency. Also, it's one of the reasons why roughly 3 hours later of a higher protein, consuming a higher protein meal, I said it wrongly, sorry. When you eat a protein-rich meal, after a threshold, your muscle protein synthesis is going to be increased. But after 3 hours of increased muscle protein synthesis, it decreases, and AMPK increases, which is the main energy sensor of your cells. The adenosine monophosphate kinase activated monophosphate activated kinase. Sorry. While G8's activity is going on, insulin sensitivity decreases, and serum glucagon, serum glucose compensatorily. I fucked it up. While G8's activity is going on, decreased insulin sensitivity and increased serum glucose compensatorily increase serum insulin levels to maintain healthy glucose levels. Also, we gotta think about the recreational athletes or professional athletes who use over 6 IUs of growth hormone. It's a bit too much, right? Considering the difference between the adult and a teenager is roughly 1 IU. And instead of having youth levels, they use 6 IUs. Drugs, don't get me wrong, drugs do what they're supposed to do. But there is no free ride. It has some side effects. One of the primary side effects is losing insulin sensitivity, because it increases serum free fatty acids. That's one of the reasons why GH decreases insulin sensitivity. So preserving your beta cell count, while that's one of the let's say good ways of using insulin is preserving your beta cell counts. Your beta cells are normally in your pancreas, right? They produce insulin. While you're introducing your body exogenous and growth hormone, while injecting over 6 IUs and consuming high kilocalorie, let's say mostly carbohydrate, and even sometimes athletes consume 900 up to 1000, sometimes above 1000 grams of carbohydrates, your beta cells take a toll. You just, how can I say? I don't know how to describe it. They just slowly die. That's how diabetics, especially type 2 diabetics, lose their beta cell count over time. They don't realize their blood glucose levels are too high, till their pancreas cannot produce more insulin while they get fat, let's say. And preserving an organ is very important, right? And a bodybuilding type of lifestyle might not be the healthiest thing to live, but you gotta maintain a certain level of health in order to have a successful career. Imagine a condition where you lose your beta cell function and eventually your pancreas dies, your beta cell dies, and you don't produce insulin. In that scenario, you're less likely to improve your physique with a non-functioning pancreas. In other words, you're more likely to improve your physique with a well-functioning pancreas. When you also, there's a difference between quick-acting and long-acting insulin, short-acting and long-acting insulins. As I said previously, your body has a feedback mechanism, and this feedback mechanism in insulin, your glucose levels is your blood glucose levels. When you have high blood glucose, your body releases insulin to bring it down. But short-acting insulins tend not to mimic your natural background insulin production. Thus, they don't have that property that much. But long-acting insulins does, especially insulin glargine or glargine, however you pronounce it. It's also called as Lantus. Well, here's a picture about how insulin works. The other branch, let's say, other branch of the cell signaling, except PI3K AKT complex. Sorry, the MAPK pathway is RAS, REF, MEK, ERK, and thus having increased cell proliferation, more protein synthesis, and cells tend not to die. It is what it does. And when you get insulin resistance, that's one of the ways your cancer, risk of cancer increases, risk of getting cancer. I said one of the ways. The other ways is toxicity of high blood glucose levels, also having higher free radicals, higher inflammation, and a couple of the other things. Those are one of the major things that makes type 2 diabetics more prone to get cancer. And also when they get it tends to spread quickly. Let's talk about the real world application. Right? I talked about how insulin works, the other fancy things, but how to implement it in the real world. As I said, insulin can be a great tool to reduce the stress on your pancreas. So imagine if an athlete who uses over 6 IUs of growth hormone a day, chances are his pancreas is working almost 100% all the time, considering he's not a super huge guy. He might need a tiny bit of low levels of background exogenous insulin to ease or decrease the stress of the pancreas, in the pancreas. Also, as I've said, growth hormones insulin's effect on IGF and IGF binding proteins are very, very well documented. Of course, there is a synergy between growth hormone, IGF, and insulin, but the same effect, same synergy also goes for cancer, unfortunately. When you, let's say, when someone decided to use insulin on their advantage, take the advantage of insulin to gain muscle. Okay, that's fine. But when they get in a state of hyperinsulinemia, they start to shoot more, but also when they shoot more and more and more, they become more insulin resistant, and also it can increase the development of atherosclerosis and actually almost the whole every single disease. It can accelerate the progression of almost every diseases. As I've said, atherosclerosis, left ventricular hypertrophy, heart sclerotic tissue in heart, or sclerotic tissue in kidney, glomerulosclerosis, which is not a fine thing to have. But we know that chronic hyperinsulinemia can increase muscle protein synthesis. But while being in a chronic hyperinsulinemic state, it's almost inevitable to get insulin resistant. While it actually lowers the effectiveness of insulin, especially for glucose uptake, it doesn't eliminate all anabolic actions. It doesn't reduce to all. It means that when you use your insulin sensitivity a bit, it means that it doesn't mean that insulin stopped working completely. It does work, but it lose its efficacy a bit, tiny bit. Here's another picture from a very, very, very good, well done research. When you're in a hyperinsulinemic state, your PI3K AKT complex get very, very inefficient. But there is one exception, which is mTOR complex 1, protein synthesis and lipid synthesis. Except those two, it just almost does not get affected by being insulin resistant. Like MEK, ERK, MAPK pathway still work. Do you see a common thing between PI3K and MEK, ERK pathway? They have something in common, which is protein synthesis. They both increase protein synthesis. Also, it might make your cancer cells grow and multiply faster. For those who think that I talk too much, I couldn't pronounce, I stuttered tons of times. I know, I sometimes tend to do that. Being deficient in insulin is not the best idea, right? Especially when you introduce more growth hormone, since your body has to release more insulin to compensate for higher blood glucose levels. When you use higher levels of growth hormone, I'm talking about especially exogenous, you've got to produce more insulin. and especially over 6 IUs, 8 IUs. Some people use some, I want to say crackheads, over like almost 15 units. Chances are your pancreas cannot keep up with that. You gotta have a tiny bit of amount of Lantus or other long-acting insulin. As I've said, now I haven't said it actually. As with many drugs and supplements, going from being a deficient state to having something physiological, or to having the top level of the reference range, let's say, is likely going to result in the biggest jump in health or performance. Let's think about it. Let's think about some guy who has insulin deficiency, right? They can't even control their blood glucose levels, so they might get hospitalized. It's a wasting disease. How the hell they are going to add mass to their frame, right? By lifting weights, also with nutrition and special sports supplements, you add literally flesh. You cannot do that with being insulin deficient. Also, it goes for testosterone, right? Imagine a male being testosterone deficient. Let's say he became a deficient yesterday. He starts to lose his motivation. He starts to have impotence. He starts to gain fat, lose muscle, and maybe become depressed. Those are common things. Brain fog. They don't have motivation to go to gym. What's going to happen? They're gonna lose their muscles. But when they go on TRT, I'm talking about legit TRT, for let's say 100 milligrams, 90 milligrams, even sometimes 110, 120, whatever. When they're in physiological range, they start to have motivation. They start to tend to do more exercise. They tend to lose their body fat. They tend to gain their lost muscle mass back, at least to some degree. Also, there are drawbacks of insulin use also. As I've said, hypoglycemia is a problem with insulin use, right? Especially when you use irresponsibly. Irresponsible insulin use might result in non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which is not a funny thing at all. When you think about how can you get fatty liver disease, you might get it by being fat, being insulin resistant, not exercising, and eating lots of foods that are bad for your health. Also, the exact opposite of what I've said, for those I've said, is at the same time the cure of the fatty liver disease, right? There is a simple and effective ways to combat that, which is physical activity, having higher lean body mass, fat-free mass, right? I mean, mostly skeletal muscle. Also, keep in mind that lean body mass is not the skeletal muscle only. It also contains bone, water retention, like organ weights. And keep in mind that almost every drug or supplements tend to almost every drug and supplement that decreases visceral fat, which is something worse than subcutaneous fat for your health, insulin resistant, or cardiovascular health, or overall health. And the drugs or supplements that also increase the insulin sensitivity have potential use in preventing or curing fatty liver disease, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease like telmisartan and metformin. You might think that, wait a minute, metformin increases AMPK, right? Decreases mTOR. Also, metformin tends to decrease mTOR independent of AMPK. So it might be a bad thing, right? I might discuss this topic in a different video, but let's talk about telmisartan. It has potential to do that. It has a drug that has a potential. Okay, but let's imagine me. Let's imagine me having a non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Thank God I don't have. And let's imagine that I also take blood pressure medications. Okay, then what? I might change my blood pressure medication under a supervision of a medical doctor to telmisartan to potentially combat the fatty liver disease. It has that possibility. It decreases visceral fat and increases insulin sensitivity. Also keep in mind that some ARBs tend to increase insulin sensitivity sometimes a bit, independent from AMPK or other fancy stuff because of the angiotensin blocking properties. That was it. Well, I'm sorry about the references page. I'm gonna edit the video and add all of the references I mentioned. As I said, insulin is not the most selective thing for muscle growth, but you or anybody that have somehow decided, which I don't recommend by the way, decided to use it for myotropic effects, muscle building effects, they might selectively implement it to, let's say, use in favor of muscle growth via environmental changes, like going to gym, right? Progressive training, diet, a very well whole food diet, training, sleeping. Well, if you have a deficiency of hormones, you might get replacement therapy for it. And also, let's say you or someone who uses exogenous insulin to boost their performance in gym, they also might be using androgens at the same time while using insulin. So in an environment like that, the behavior of the hormones, it changes. It's not complete change, but it does change, obviously. Keep in mind that. Also, I just want to say sorry about how I'm stuttering or sometimes stopping or pronunciation errors. I just want to say I'm sorry in advance, but it's gonna get better. It almost takes 1 or 2 weeks or so. I'm gonna also upload a video about my background, how I got into this PED whole thing. I'm gonna upload another video. Since okay, till next time, take care. Till next time, bye bye.